Ultor drew his sword fast, and Ruth jumped to her feet as well, looking around for the sign of danger that Ultor had sensed. She saw nothing at first, and glanced at Ultor expectantly. He didn't look back. His eyes were trained on the march beyond, where a veil of fireflies danced in the darkness. "I don't see anyone," Ruth pointed out. "Don't try to see them. Listen," Ultor instructed. "Trusting your eyes at night is foolish. Trust your hearing." Ruth flushed with embarrassment and closed her eyes to listen, and sure enough she could hear something. Amidst the singing frogs and hooting owls there was the sound of displacing water. Several footsteps moving through the ankle-deep marsh. They were trying to stay silent by moving slowly, but the water was giving them away. "It's no wonder the Iron Legion was ambushed on our way in here," Ruth whispered darkly. "The mire may be unpleasant, but it has natural advantages for the samurai. It's very difficult to launch a surprise attack in the swamp," Ultor agreed. "Well, who do you think it is?" Ruth asked. "Bandits? Samurai maybe? Or worse? It doesn't matter. They went to the trouble of trying to ambush us, which means they aren't allies. Ready yourself, Ruth." Ruth nodded and silently took note of the tone in Ultor's voice, as well as his grim practicality. Now she understood how he'd survived so long outside of the Order. It wasn't just his swordsmanship. He had a mind for battle and survival. Ruth didn't have time to compliment him, though, as their attackers suddenly revealed themselves. There were 7 in total. 3 Orochi warriors, a conqueror whose legion emblem had been scorched off, a massive Shugoki leading the pack, and behind him 2 berserkers. A strange amalgamation, but Ultor had mentioned that the marauders were not just pirates, but a diverse group of warriors. They were likely here for Hotaru. Ruth moved fast to take the berserker. He dodged right and swung one of his axes at her head in a wide swing. Ruth parried the strike and kicked him away to deal with the second berserker, who was leaping at her with a wild scream of fury. She dodged his downward strike and slashed at his back, but the strike wasn't strong enough to go through his armor. The berserker rolled with it and let out a whooping laugh as he launched himself at her again. Pushing forward, she countered the high strike and brought her blade down on his head. This time the steel found flesh and bit, and as the berserker howled with pain, blood sprayed from his forehead. Ruth prepared for the final blow, but when the first berserker attacked her blind left side and struck at the side of her with her axe, Ruth winced. Though her armor absorbed most of the strike, she could feel the painful bruise the blow had no doubt caused. She jumped back as the 2 berserkers tried to rally. And it was then she realized that she was only fighting 2 warriors. Ultor must be dealing with the 5 others. She dared to glance back and shout to him, but when she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Ultor was death incarnate. The first Orochi was already on the ground, his arm removed at the elbow and screaming in agony. The kill wasn't clean because Ultor had clearly moved on after disabling him to deal with his fellows. The second Orochi was in the process of being decapitated as Ultor struck his blade into the side of his neck and spun himself around the Orochi's shoulder to let the blade cleanly cut through his throat. But as the Orochi fell, Ultor's sword flew up to block a downward blow from the Shugoki. The crushing club should have broken Ultor's arm at least, but Ultor slid the blade along the club's path, allowing it to graze down the length of the sword, and in the same instant, Ultor pirouetted and hacked a vicious gash along the Shugoki's hip, sending the giant behemoth stumbling back, cursing in his own language. In a matter of seconds, Ultor had killed 2 Orochi and injured a massive Shugoki warrior. And all that Ruth had done was injure just one of the berserkers. She felt a degree of shame and turned her attention back to her own quarry. The 2 berserkers were now attacking together, blood pouring down the second one's face as they both howled and roared their angry cries of battle. Ruth blocked and evaded the strikes, waiting for an opening. That moment came as the one with blood running down his face had to pause, clutching his head, and that momentary opening gave Ruth a chance. She rushed him and slammed her shoulder into his chest. The berserker staggered and she impaled him through the chest. She didn't stop. She pushed hard and ran her sword through him all the way to the hilt. She then shoved the tip of her blade into the ground itself, leaving the impaled berserker there, her sword jutting up from the marshy ground where the berserker skewered through it. As his comrade rushed at her for revenge, she sidestepped him, grabbed the back of his head, and slammed his forehead as hard as she could into the pommel of her sword, smashing his nose and leaving him squealing. She then, in one fluid motion, yanked her sword out of the ground and her bloody skewered prey as well, and slashed open the Viking's neck with a clean strike. Both Vikings fell, blood pooling and mixing with swamp water. "Ultor!" she cried, running to aid him. to see that Ultor was locked in vicious battle with the Orochi and Shugoki. She ran to aid him, but Ultor shouted back. "Leave this to me! Get Hotaru!" he shouted. It was in that moment Ruth realized the Conqueror had vanished. This fight was just a distraction. She spun and sprinted for the thicket where the child had been hidden. Behind her, Ultor was battling wildly. The Orochi made a fainting dash to provide an opening for the Shugoki to swing his heavy club, but the bleeding gash in his hip slowed his movements. Ultor dodged under the lazy swing and brought his sword down to block the Orochi's follow-up. They weren't giving him a chance to be aggressive or to go on the offense. They were forcing him to stay on the defensive. "Hand over the girl and we won't kill you," the Shugoki barked fiercely. "You're in no position to make demands," Ultor snarled back. "You're exhausted, and this is our turf. We've got you outnumbered," the Orochi reasoned, raising his katana. "You two are nothing but dogs," Ultor responded. "And no matter their numbers, dogs can't kill me." The Orochi bristled and shot forward with a rushing charge, drawing his sword up to strike his head. Ultor lunged forward, the katana glancing off his helmet, but his own sword finding an exposed neck. The Orochi fell, his neck bubbling blood as he struggled to breathe. The Shugoki rushed and headbutted Ultor hard. Despite his protective helmet, Ultor's ears were ringing and he staggered back. This was the risk he had to take. He had to take out one and accept the blow from the other. The Shugoki then swept his club at Ultor's feet. Ultor tried to time his dodge, but his head was still spinning, and he missed by a fraction of a second. His legs buckled and he fell on his back, looking up at his foe. "Still think I am a dog?" the Shugoki asked, raising his club to finish him. Ultor sneered and rolled out of the way, grabbing the fallen katana of the dead Orochi and shoving the blade into the knee of his foe. The Shugoki screamed and fell, clutching his leg in agony as Ultor rose to his feet. "No," he answered. "The way you squeal, I'd say you're a pig." The last sensation the Shugoki felt was a sword cutting down his skull, cutting off his screams mid-note. As his body fell, Ultor stepped back to catch his breath, shaking his head furiously. "God, hate those fat bastards." "Ultor!" Ruth cried, running towards him, her helmet off and her eyes wide and worried. "They got her! They got Hotaru!" Ultor's demeanor shifted from relief to terror in an instant. "What happened?" "The Conqueror slipped away during the fight. The thicket's been torn apart. He must have grabbed her and taken her away," Ruth cried. Ultor cursed furiously. "I'm sorry, Ultor. I tried to catch up." "It's not your fault," Ultor snarled angrily. "No, it's mine. I'm to blame. This is my fault." "No, it's not," Ruth argued. "We were outnumbered. There was nothing we could have—" "I gave her my word!" Ultor shouted. "I swore I'd not let that girl come to harm. I swore I'd get her home, and now I... He shivered with anguish and sank to a knee. "We'll never be able to track them in the mire." Ruth approached him carefully and a little fearfully. Ultor was her ally, but was he a friend? She'd watched him and how he fought, and she'd be a fool to drop her guard around him. She reached out, though, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ultor, it's not too late to find her," Ruth pointed out. "The Conqueror won't know these swamps well. He'll have left a trail. We can track him that way." Ultor's shoulders steadied somewhat, and he nodded. "You're right. Yes, you're right. We'll follow him. We'll get her back," he growled. "I'm with you," Ruth nodded. Ultor didn't say anything, but again began running through the thicket to look for clues. As he searched, Ruth followed, coughing to get his attention. Ultor? Forgive me, but..." "We don't have time," Ultor growled. "The longer we chat, the further that bastard gets. We can talk later." Ruth relented and turned towards the ground. She stopped at a footprint in the muck, too large for any little girl. "Ultor, I think he may have run this way." Ultor looked at the print and nodded. "Good eye. Let's follow it." He marched off with Ruth behind him. The two said nothing for a time, pausing every so often to find evidence of the trail. A footprint there, a drop of blood here, a broken branch that was out of place. Yet as they walked, Ruth glanced curiously at Ultor. There was more to this story, more to his devotion to Hotaru. She had to know more, but she was fearful to approach the subject, at least carelessly. And after an hour of walking, Ultor stopped by a tree, leaning against it to catch his breath. It was still dark, but dawn would be coming before long. Ruth tried to risk it. "Ultor," she finally whispered, Ultor, I'm sure you're upset, but this seems strange for you. Why did you make an oath to Hotaru? Why do you care so much about her?
Ultor didn't answer at first, but merely stood still, and Ruth's hand drifted to her sword in case he lunged at her, but he didn't. He shook violently for a moment and then slumped his shoulders. Do you know why I went after those marauders in the first place?
You never told me.
The marauders wanted Hotaru as a ransom chip for her father. But they aren't just kidnappers, Ruth. They're slavers.
Slavers, Ruth cried. Slavery has been outlawed in Heathmore for generations.
The pirates that came to our shores revealed to Heathmore that there was a world beyond our seas. A world of countries and nations and peoples of various beliefs, cultures, and practices. And there are some cultures who would pay handsomely for slaves. Especially female slaves. Young slaves. Virgin slaves.
Ruth bristled under her armor. That's outrageous!
My guess, Ultor continued, is that they captured Hotaru to be a slave until they found out who she was. But that didn't change the things I saw on those ships. Women chained to walls like luggage, some barely clothed. Children lumped together with moldy rope and rusted chains. Half of them were so starved they couldn't even look up at me when I entered the ship. And they didn't care where you were from either. I saw children there of Viking clans, samurai, of Ashveldian nations as well. I saw women and children from all over Heathmore.
Ultor, how many ships did those marauders have?
I burned 5 of them, but I'm sure there were more docked. But I'm sure those weren't the only ones they owned. There were probably others not docked at that port, Ultor replied. And I've been hunting these marauders ever since I learned what they were doing. I freed every captive I could find, but some didn't even have the strength left to stand, let alone leave the ships. Some just wanted to die on those ships.
By God, Ruth whispered. So you let them burn along with them?
What else could I do? I couldn't convince them to move. I tried grabbing one, her arm broke in my grip, she was so fragile. There was nothing I could do. Some of them were just walking corpses as it was. It hurt, Ruth. I'd never felt such pain before. I spent my whole life fighting, thinking that it was the right thing to do. But I was never fighting for something, until I saw the kind of evil that infests this world.
But what about Hotaru? Ruth asked. What changed with her?
Hotaru was a fighter. She had enough energy to not only stand up to me, but brandish a dagger in my face. I suppose you could say she fascinated me. It takes a special kind of person to glare into hell and then still have the will to fight. I liked that about her.
You want to save her because you see something in her worth saving, then?
No, Ruth, I want to save her because I'm tired of just fighting battles to see people die. I'm tired of watching injustice go on while warriors like us do nothing to stop it. And I'm sick and tired of watching children suffer. I've buried enough of them. I won't bury another. No father should outlive their child.
Ruth walked beside Ultor and placed her hand on his shoulder. Fear not, Ultor. We won't bury her, and I won't rest until she's safe.
Ultor stiffened but nodded. I'm grateful to you, Ruth. I truly am. But I'm afraid we've run into a problem.
Well, what is it? She asked.
Ultor pointed out to the east and sighed. Though it was still dark, he seemed to know exactly what he was looking for. Their camp is over there, he explained.
I can't see anything in the dark, Ruth answered.
Take off your helmet and smell the air. You can smell fire and cooking pork. The samurai don't eat pig that often, so whoever's cooking it aren't from a samurai village. And since the conqueror went this way,
it means their camp must be there, Ruth agreed.
And it'll be heavily guarded. They'll have many warriors, will likely be outnumbered. We could try to take them by surprise, but there's a chance they'll just use the prisoners as body shields, even if we manage to fight our way through their army. We need a way to secure the prisoners first, then we can worry about taking out the marauders.
Are you sure we can't sneak inside? Ruth asked.
Do I look like a peacekeeper or shinobi to you? Ultor asked. I've never been good at the stealthy approach. I'd say we should go and look for backup, but there's no time. By the time we would get anything, the marauders would have moved on.
Ruth thought it over a moment, and then nodded. Ultor? She touched his hand and took her helmet off so her eyes could see his. Ultor, I want you to know that I trust you with my life.
What are you talking about?
Ultor asked, confused. I have a plan. I will secure the prisoners and Hotaru so you don't have to worry about them.
How will you do this?
Ultor asked. Ruth began ripping off her gauntlets and greaves, making Ultor step back in surprise.
Why are you removing your armor? What are you doing?
Never known a slave who wore armor, did you? She asked. You said yourself, they like to take women, and they aren't particular about where they come from, right?
Ultor's expression turned sour. You're going to surrender yourself to them.
I'll be helpless without my armor or weapon. You'll need to watch those for me.
You're insane, Ultor hissed. You'll be killed, or worse.
Ultor, I am not your equal in combat. I know that, Ruth sighed. In every way, you are my better, and I admire your skill. You can protect that girl and all of Heathmore in a way I can never do. So I beg you, let me offer what little assistance I can.
You're too hard on yourself, Ruth. And even if what you say is true, that's no excuse to throw your life away.
It's the only way I can free those prisoners. Do you have a better suggestion?
Ultor started to argue but stopped, realizing there was little he could do to stop her. Ruth, if something were to happen, if you were to get hurt...
Ultor, did you fear for your own safety when you ran onto the marauder ships to rescue the slaves?
Of course I didn't.
Neither do I. Ruth threw aside her armor until all that was left was her tunic. I know what I'm risking. There was a tremble in her voice. Fear. Ultor realized what she was risking, and that she knew it.
Ultor looked her over and sighed, nodding his head. He wouldn't deny her this. If this is what you want, this will do.
Not quite. I think I look too clean, and a woman of my features would look strange in the mire.
I'm afraid I have to agree. So what's your solution?
Ruth stood up straight and then turned to Ultor, toughening her lip and looking austere. Ultor, I need you to strike me.
What?
Bruise me. Hit me, cut me, make it look as if I struggled to escape captors or jailers, Ruth offered.
You wish me to harm you?
Ultor asked. Hold nothing back. I have to look like I escaped somehow. If they see a North-born woman running through the mire like this, they'll obviously think I was just an escaped prisoner. Easily caught, they won't suspect me being a knight.
I'm not sure if you're mad or brilliant, Ultor grumbled. He then raised his fist to her. Just remember this was your plan.
I'll keep it in mind.
Ruth winced as a metal gauntlet crashed into her ribs. Whatever their plan and whatever outcome, they were set in it. Ruth bit her lip as she felt the pain of 100 hits, knowing that each one would help her restore her own honor and help save Ultor the shame of losing another child.